The afternoon sun filtered through the high-arched windows of the estate's conservatory, catching the precise, rhythmic movement of Callan's silver pocket knife. He was peeling an apple, his fingers impossibly deft and steady with a soft, satisfied murmur. He carved a perfect crescent, lifted it on the tip of the blade, and offered it to Lyra. "Is it sweet enough?" he asked, his voice a low, melodious purr. He was resting his head entirely in her lap, his dark hair spilled across her linen skirt like silk. To anyone looking through the glass, it was a picture of sickeningly sweet domestic bliss. Callan looked like a gentle, adoring hound, utterly tamed by the plain, quiet girl holding him. Lyra took the apple slice, her fingers lightly brushing his cheek. "It's perfect, Callan," she murmured. He smiled, a blinding, radiant thing that completely transformed his sharp, aristocratic features, and went back to peeling. Lyra's hand moved to stroke his hair, her touch steady, though her mind remained a hypervigilant calculator. She knew the truth. She knew that beneath this beautiful, docile facade lay an absolute void of human empathy. She remembered, with chilling clarity, the young Viscount who had loudly called her an uninspired, plain leech at a banquet 3 months ago. Callan had smiled politely at the insult. The very next evening, the Viscount had been found in a dark alleyway, his kneecaps systematically shattered into powder. He would never walk again. No one could prove Callan did it, but Lyra had found the faint scent of copper and the Viscount's signet ring tucked neatly into Callan's bedside drawer. Because she kept him on such a tight leash, constantly pulling him away from social gatherings, managing his schedule, and never leaving his side, the provincial town's high society despised her. The whispers outside the estate gates were vicious. "She's a controlling, jealous snake. She's suffocating his brilliance because she knows a prodigy like him would leave a plain girl." The moment he saw the capital, Lyra absorbed the hatred in absolute silence. She didn't defend herself, she couldn't. If she told them the truth that she stayed by his side purely to keep the local populace from being slaughtered, Ellen would simply eliminate the people who made her feel the need to explain herself. She was a civilian sitting on a nuclear warhead, smiling through the exhaustion until the spring banquet. The grand ballroom of the governor's estate was suffocatingly crowded when Lady Elara made her move. Elara, the Duke's daughter, who had suddenly awakened months ago with a bizarre, fiercely confident heroine aura, marched straight through the center of the crowd. She stopped directly in front of Lyra, flanked by a dozen high-ranking nobles who eagerly anticipated a show. Callan, who had been standing a half-step behind Lyra with his usual bored, placid expression, froze. His eyes, normally a warm amber when looking at Lyra, instantly turned to dead, localized glass. "Lady Lyra," Elara's voice rang out, dripping with self-righteous, savior complex pride. She looked at Lyra like a scientist examining a parasite. "I have watched you for weeks, and I can no longer stay silent. Look at him." Elara gestured dramatically to Callan. "You are suffocating him. You have trapped a man of his immense, world-altering brilliance in this stagnant provincial town purely because of your own pathetic insecurities." The ballroom went dead silent. Several nobles smirked behind their silk fans. Elara took a step closer, her chest puffed out with the unshakable certainty of someone who believed they were reading from a script. "He received a royal decree to become the imperial commander in the capital, yet he hesitates because of you. You've wrapped him in toxic chains, forcing him to cater to your dependency. He deserves to fly, Lyra. He deserves to be the imperial commander, free of your suffocating grasp." Whispers of agreement rippled through the crowd. Finally, someone said it. "The leech is being called out." Lyra looked at Elara's glowing, triumphant face, then she looked slightly lower, beneath his immaculate dress coat. Callan's left hand had moved to his side. His fingers were white-knuckling the hilt of his sword. The leather of his glove creaked under the sheer, terrifying force of his grip. He wasn't looking at Elara's face. His eyes were locked entirely on the soft pulse point of her throat, calculating the exact trajectory required to sever her head before the guards could even draw their weapons. If Lyra defended herself, Elara would die tonight, and the kingdom would hunt Kalen. Suddenly, a profound, icy wave of exhaustion washed over Lyra. She looked at the mocking smiles of the nobles, the smug arrogance of the transmigrator, and the sheer stupidity of a society that thought it knew better. They want him so badly. She thought, let them have him. Lyra played her part perfectly. She let her shoulders slump. She dropped her eyes to the polished floor, allowing her lower lip to tremble. She forced her breathing to hitch, letting a single, tragic tear slip down her cheek. When she looked back up at Alara, her face was a masterpiece of broken, submissive grief. "You're right," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking loud enough for the front row to hear. Alara blinked, momentarily taken aback by the lack of resistance, before her smile widened with immense satisfaction. "I am so sorry," Lyra sobbed softly, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. "It's my fault, it's all my fault for caging him, you see him so clearly. Lady Alara, I've been so blind, holding him back from his glorious destiny because I was afraid." Alara practically beamed, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of a successful protagonist who had just liberated a tragic villain from his abuser. "Recognizing your toxicity is the first step, Lyra," Alara said grandly. Her tone dripping with patronizing pity. Lyra ignored her. She turned her tear-streaked face to Kellen. The air around Kellen was vibrating with an oppressive, lethal pressure. His jaw was clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek, his gaze pleading with Lyra, practically begging for her permission to tear the room apart, slowly, deliberately. Lyra reached out, she gently tapped the inside of his right wrist, the secret childhood command they had shared for over a decade: "Stand down, obey." Kellen's entire frame stiffened. The lethal aura didn't disappear, but it imploded, trapping the violence inside his own chest. His eyes fixed on hers, frantic and burning with a dark, desperate confusion. Lyra offered him a small, tragic, utterly beautiful smile. "Go to the capital, Kellen," she said softly, her voice echoing like a death knell in the silent ballroom. "Be exactly who you want to be." The grand thoroughfare of the imperial capital was awash in gold and crimson banners, vibrating with the collective roar of 1,000 citizens. At the head of the procession rode Lady Alara, her posture immaculate, her face fixed in a radiant, triumphant grin. This was her moment. She had freed the tragic, bound hero from his provincial parasite. She was escorting the future savior of the empire to his rightful throne of glory, and the world was here to witness her narrative victory. Beside her, Kellen rode a massive, pitch-black stallion. He wore the stark dark leather and silver filigree of the imperial commander, looking every bit the lethal, breathtaking protagonist Alara had read about, but he hadn't spoken a single word since they left the province. He hadn't smiled. He didn't look at the cheering crowds, nor at the flowers being tossed at his horse's hooves. His eyes were fixed entirely on the straight line of the cobblestone road ahead, flat and chillingly vacant. "He's just adjusting," Alara reassured herself, her heart fluttering with romantic anticipation. "He's processing his freedom. Once he realizes he's safe with me, he'll open up." The procession ground to a sudden, jarring halt at the gates of the inner citadel. A high-ranking noble officer, flanked by a dozen heavily armored palace guards, stepped squarely into the center of the street. He was a relative of the prime minister, notorious for his arrogance and eager to assert dominance over this new upstart from the countryside. "Hold your mount, Commander," the officer sneered, his voice dripping with condescension as he raised a gloved hand to block Kellen's horse. "The capital is not your provincial playground. Dismount and present your royal credentials for inspection before you dare cross." Kellen didn't blink, he didn't draw a breath, he didn't even slow his horse. There was no warning, no dramatic declaration, no shift in his dead expression. In a flash of steel so blindingly fast it left an arc of silver in the afternoon air, Kellen drew his blade, the sword swung in a perfect, casual crescent. A sickening shock echoed over the sudden silence of the crowd. The noble officer's hand, still encased in its fine leather glove, severed cleanly at the wrist and dropped into the dirt with a heavy, wet thud. For one agonizing second, there was absolute silence. Then, the fountain of crimson erupted, the officer collapsed into the dust, clutching his mangled forearm, shrieking in a high-pitched, primal agony that pierced the sky. The surrounding palace guards froze, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the strike. Without breaking stride, Kellen nudged his stallion forward. The heavy iron hooves of his mount stepped directly onto the severed hand, crushing the bones beneath into the mud. Before riding right over the screaming, thrashing officer, "Stop, stop." Alara's voice tore from her throat. A shrill, hysterical screech that shattered her heroine facade. She violently yanked the reins of her horse, lunging forward to grab Kellen's armored forearm. Her entire body was trembling. her face completely drained of color as she stared at the pooling blood on the cobblestones. "What are you doing, my God? Kellen, stop." She wept, her modern sensibilities fracturing under the raw, unscripted brutality of the moment. "This isn't who you are, you're a hero." "This isn't who you are." Slowly, Kellen turned his head. Elara's breath hitched. She expected to see rage, or madness, or a trace of defensive panic. Instead, she found nothing. His eyes were dead, cold, and entirely empty to bottomless pits of absolute indifference. He looked at her not as a savior, or a woman, but as a minor inconvenience on the road. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was sickeningly reminiscent of how he used to look at Lyra when asking for a treat. "This is exactly who I am," Kellen replied, his voice a calm, melodic, and terrifyingly level murmur. "Lyra just isn't here to tell me not to." He pulled his arm from her grasp with an effortless flick of his wrist and continued riding toward the palace. Leaving a trail of dark blood behind him, the weeks that followed turned the imperial court into a living purgatory. Kellen didn't wait for a political catalyst to become a tyrant. He simply unveiled the predator he had always been. On his third day, he executed a high-ranking lieutenant on the training grounds for missing a formation, slicing the man's throat in front of the entire regiment without a word of explanation. On his first week in the High Court, a corrupt minister tried to subtly threaten his authority. Kellen didn't play the game of political chess. He had the minister dragged to the center of the plaza in broad daylight and systematically tortured by the executioners until the man signed away his entire lineage's assets. The emperor sat on his throne, paralyzed with fear, realizing he had invited a god of ruin into his home. The court nobles walked on eggshells, terrified to breathe too loudly, terrified to even make eye contact with the dark-haired demon who now held the leash to the military. Desperate to fix the broken plot, Elara tried everything. Armed with her knowledge of modern psychology and the romantic tropes of a dozen novels, she flooded his quarters. She brought him specialized teas to soothe his nerves. She arranged elaborate candlelight dinners, trying to initiate soft, vulnerable conversations about his childhood trauma. She attempted to use therapeutic validation, speaking in gentle, soothing tones about breaking free from codependent cycles and finding his true self. Kellen treated her like an annoying insect. When she spoke, he simply stared through her, his silence so heavy and suffocating it made her skin crawl. When she left a plate of delicate pastries on his desk, he used his dagger to slowly, meticulously scrape them into the waste bin while looking her directly in the eyes. He didn't touch her, he didn't look at her. And he didn't sleep. Every night, Elara would pass by the commander's quarters, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and despair. Through the crack in the door, she would see him sitting alone in the dark, illuminated only by a single dying candle. He wouldn't be resting. He would just sit there in total, chilling silence, a white cloth in his hand, slowly and rhythmically cleaning his flawless, gleaming blade over and over, waiting for the next person to cross his path, waiting for the world to burn. While the capital suffocated under Kellen's quiet terror, the provincial town where it all began remained blissfully, stupidly arrogant. To the local nobles, Lyra's absolute withdrawal from society wasn't a sign of peaceful retirement. It was proof of her utter humiliation. They saw her walking alone to the market, no longer flanked by the terrifying prodigy, and assumed she was broken. Emboldened by her silence and intoxicated by the news of Kellen's dazzling, brutal ascent in the capital, a group of high society cynics gathered at a salon, over wine and laughter. They penned a letter. They meant it as a flattering congratulation to the new imperial commander, a subtle sycophantic gesture wrapped in a cruel joke at Lyra's expense. They sent it straight to the capital, sealed with fine wax. They thought they were being clever. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Lady Elara was standing in the war room, frantically reviewing troop placements, trying to find a way to regain control over the crumbling narrative. Kellen sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a shadow over the maps. When the messenger knelt and handed him the provincial missive, Kellen broke the seal with a casual flick of his thumb. Elara watched him read. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The ink on the map table caught a tremor not from Kellen's hands, which remained impossibly still, but from the sudden, oppressive pressure radiating from his frame. The letter sneered at his past. It praised him for finally discarding the manipulative, plain childhood friend who had caged him, painting a vivid, mocking picture of how Lyra was now miserable, isolated, and precisely where a common girl belongs back in the mud of the province. Kellen didn't scream. He didn't tear the paper. He simply stared at the words until the silence became so heavy that the messenger on the floor began to gasp for air, suffocating under the sheer density of Kellen's bloodlust. In his mind, something fundamental fractured. He didn't see a petty piece of gossip. He saw proof. Proof that the moment he took his eyes off his sanctuary, the world had descended upon her like vultures. If he was in the capital, they mocked her in the province. If he went to the borders, they would hurt her at home. Humanity was a collective plague, actively tormenting his center of gravity. "Commander," the Prime Minister's envoy stammered, stepping forward with a stack of tax ledgers. "We need your signature on the." Kellen rose. The chair behind him didn't scrape. It shattered against the wall as if struck by a phantom gale. "Assemble the vanguard," Kellen said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a flat, hollow whisper that vibrated through the floorboards. "We are marching." "Marching?" Alara asked, her heart leaping into her throat. "The rebel forces are to the east." "Kellen, the campaign hasn't." "Not east," Kellen interrupted, turning his dead, hollow eyes toward her. "South, through the capital gates, and down to the provinces." The room descended into a frantic panic. The Prime Minister's envoy threw himself in front of the door, his hands trembling as he held up his staff of office. "Lord Kellen, you cannot turn the Imperial Army back onto the Empire's own lands. This is treason." "The Emperor will." Before the man could finish his sentence, Kellen moved. It wasn't a duel, it was an execution. He lunged forward, gripped the minister by his silk collar with one hand, and dragged him toward the heavy velvet ropes of the window drapes. With a terrifying, casual display of brute strength, Kellen looped the cord around the man's neck and threw him over the high balcony railing. A sickening snap echoed into the war room as the minister's body dropped, dangling limply against the palace facade in broad daylight. "Anyone who does not mount their horse in 10 minutes. Kellen murmured to the horrified, frozen officers, "will join him." He walked out of the room, his boots clicking rhythmically against the marble, leaving behind a decree that spread through the ranks like wildfire. The vanguard army was turning back. They were to raise the capital's high society, then march on the provinces, executing every noble family until no one was left alive to look down on his wife. Alara collapsed against the mahogany table, her legs completely giving out. She looked out the window at the dangling corpse of the minister, then down at the courtyard where thousands of ironclad soldiers were already mounting their horses, their faces pale with terror, entirely subjugated by Kellen's absolute malice. A cold, paralyzing despair washed over her as she recalled the spring banquet weeks ago. She remembered Lyra's tragic, submissive tears. She remembered how easily the girl had stepped aside, whispering, "I am so sorry, it's my fault for caging him." Alara began to weep, dry, hysterical tears of pure horror. It hadn't been a defeat. Lyra hadn't been crying for herself. She had been mourning them. The plain, quiet girl hadn't been a toxic leech holding back a hero. She had been the only thin, fragile barrier standing between a predatory monster and the throat of the entire kingdom. And Alara had smugly severed it. Lyra's apology wasn't a concession of guilt. It was a death warrant for the world. The morning air in the province was crisp, smelling faintly of damp earth and blooming jasmine. On the wraparound porch of her quiet estate, Lyra sat in a wicker rocking chair. A delicate porcelain teacup rested on the small table beside her, steam curling softly into the breeze. In her lap was a half-finished winter sweater of thick, charcoal gray wool. Her knitting needles clicked together in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. The serene silence was violently shattered by the distant, frantic thundering of hooves and the screeching of iron-rimmed wheels down the gravel driveway. A line of extravagant royal carriages tore through the estate gates. The horses were lathered in white foam, chests heaving as if ridden to the brink of death. Before the lead carriage could even grind to a complete halt, its door burst open. Out tumbled Lady Elara. The glowing, immaculate heroine aura was utterly gone. Her fine silk gown was torn, stained with splatters of dark court blood, and her hair was a matted, wild nest. She collapsed directly into the damp mud of the driveway, scrambling onto her hands and knees. Behind her, a dozen of the highest-ranking nobles and socialites from both the capital and the province scrambled out of the trailing carriages, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror. In a pathetic, desperate wave, The crowd rushed the porch, throwing themselves face first into the dirt at Lyra's feet. "Lady Lyra, please, please." The young baroness who had once loudly laughed at Lyra's plain, uninspired face was now weeping hysterically, her expensive velvet sleeves soaking up the mud. "He slaughtered the entire Imperial Guard. The capital is burning. He's marching here with the vanguard, tracking the authors of that wretched letter. He swears he will execute our entire bloodlines, tear down our ancestral homes, and leave nothing but ash. Save us." Beside her, Alara pressed her forehead directly into the grass, her shoulders shaking with violent, ragged sobs, all of her modern psychology, her plot knowledge, and her self-righteous pride had been utterly crushed under the weight of reality. "I was so wrong, Lyra. I didn't understand," Alara wailed, her voice cracking as she clutched at the bottom step of the porch. "I thought I was saving a hero. I didn't know. He's not human. He is a monster, an absolute demon, and you are the only thing keeping him tethered to humanity. Please, I beg you, take the leash back. Put him back in his cage." Lyra didn't stop knitting. Clack, clack, clack. She didn't glance up at the weeping transmigrator, nor did she flinch at the hysterical cries of the nobility. She calmly slid her needle through a loop of gray wool, pulled the yarn taut, and took a slow, elegant sip of her tea. "The mud is rather deep today, isn't it?" Lyra remarked softly, her voice cool and perfectly level against the chorus of frantic weeping. "Lady Lyra, please have mercy," a wealthy count shrieked, trembling so violently his teeth chattered. "The vanguard army is less than an hour behind us. He will kill us all." "I am a toxic leech, remember," Lyra said, finally setting her knitting down in her lap. She looked down at them from the elevated porch, her eyes flat, dark, and entirely unbothered. "A controlling, jealous snake who suffocates brilliant men because of her own pathetic insecurities. Why would a parasitic girl like me step between the Imperial commander and his desires?" The nobles choked on their sobs, the agonizing weight of their past malice crashing down upon them. "We were fools, blind, arrogant fools," the Baroness screamed, lifting her tear-streaked face from the dirt. "Splendid. Then let us test your memories," Lyra murmured, reaching under her sewing basket and pulling out a thick, crumpled stack of parchment. It was a collection of every anonymous satirical piece, every public rumor, and every mocking letter spread about her over the last 3 years. She tossed the pages over the railing. They fluttered down, landing in the mud directly in front of the ringleaders. "Read them," Lyra commanded softly. Alara blinked through her tears. "Lyra, there's no time," I said. "Read them," Lyra repeated, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that made everyone freeze. Every single word, loudly, clearly, and explicitly state who wrote them. With trembling, mud-slicked fingers, the Baroness picked up the first page. Through choked sobs and a cracking voice, she began to read aloud her own vicious rumors. Her voice echoing across the courtyard. One by one, the other nobles joined in, forced to verbalize their own hypocrisy, their own cruelty, and their own stupidity while kneeling in the dirt. Lyra picked up her teacup, leaning back in her rocking chair as she watched the grandest names in the kingdom humiliate themselves. She made them stay on their knees. She made them swallow every insult they had ever hurled at her, forcing them to explicitly acknowledge a terrifying reality: the only reason they were currently breathing, the only reason their families hadn't been slaughtered years ago, was because the plain, quiet girl they despised had chosen to be merciful. Their lives did not belong to the Emperor. Their lives did not belong to the army. Their survival rested entirely in the hands of the girl in the wicker chair. The recitation of their own malice was still echoing through the courtyard when the southern horizon bled into a thick, apocalyptic crimson. A heavy cloud of dust and black smoke choked out the midday sun. Then came the vibration, a rhythmic, terrifying thud that rattled the porcelain teacup on Lyra's table. The vanguard had arrived. Hundreds of ironclad cavalrymen flooded the estate gates, their armor scorched, their horses panting. But they did not storm the grounds. They halted in a rigid, terrified formation, clearing a wide, silent path for the figure walking at the center. Kellen didn't ride, he walked. He looked like a literal god of ruin. The immaculate silver filigree of his Imperial commander uniform was almost entirely obscured by a thick, drying crust of dark blood. It splattered his chest, stained his jaw, and coated his bare right hand, which loosely gripped a long, notched broadsword. The air around him visually warped with a heavy, suffocating pressure and unhinged, psychotic aura of pure death that made the air itself taste like copper. The nobles shrieked, a collective, pathetic wail of absolute despair. They violently threw themselves flat against the mud, pressing their faces into the grass. Covering their necks as they waited for the inevitable execution strike, Elara squeezed her eyes shut, paralyzed by the sheer terror of his approach. Callan stepped into the courtyard, his dead, hollow gaze sweeping over the trembling bodies in the dirt. He raised his sword, his muscles tensing for the slaughter. Then, his eyes flicked upward. He landed on the porch. He saw Lyra. Instantly, the suffocating pressure vanished, the terrifying, murderous aura that had brought an empire to its knees simply evaporated into the afternoon breeze. In a heartbeat, Callan's entire posture shifted. The lethal, apex predator collapsed inward, transforming into a tired, lost, homesick boy. The unhinged glare in his eyes melted into a desperate, aching warmth without a glance at the nobles. He let his fingers loosen. The bloody broadsword fell from his grip, clattering heavily into the mud. He stumbled up the wooden steps of the porch, his heavy, blood-soaked boots leaving dark tracks on the clean white floorboards. Reaching her chair, he sank to his knees. He didn't look back at the world he had broken. He simply buried his face entirely in Lyra's lap, his hands clutching desperately at the rough, charcoal-gray wool of the unfinished sweater she had been knitting. They were so loud, Lyra, he murmured, his melodious voice trembling with a raw, genuine vulnerability that sent chills down the spines of the listening nobles. He pressed closer, hiding his face in her skirt like a child seeking shelter from a storm. They kept saying horrible things about you. Everywhere I went, the whispers wouldn't stop. I cut out their tongues. I killed so many of them, but I couldn't make the world quiet. I couldn't make them stop. I missed you. I missed you so much. The courtyard was dead silent, save for the faint sound of Callan's ragged breathing and the distant crackle of burning capital banners. The elite of the kingdom lay frozen in the mud, utterly breathless, realizing that the demon who had slaughtered the Imperial Guard was currently weeping in the lap of a plain provincial girl. Lyra did not flinch from the blood on his clothes. She set her knitting needles down and gently reached out, running her fingers through his dark, silken hair. With the soft pat of her thumb, she tenderly wiped a stray splash of court blood from his cheekbone. She looked over his head, her flat, dark eyes locking onto the trembling, sobbing form of Lady Elara, whose modern world had been completely annihilated. I know, my love. You did so well, Lyra whispered, her calm, soothing voice echoing with terrifying clarity across the silent yard. She stroked his head, molding the monster back into her gentle hound with a single touch. Then, her gaze dropped completely onto the transmigrator. Her voice lost its warmth, turning into a command as cold as ice. Apologize to my husband, Lady Elara. Apologize to him for forcing him to leave his home. Elara didn't hesitate. Shaking violently, she frantically dragged herself through the mud, pressing her face as hard as she could into the grass before the porch stairs. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. She wept hysterically, her voice broken, her hands digging into the earth. Forgive me. Lord Callan, I was wrong. I'm sorry for forcing you away. Please, I'm sorry. Callan didn't even turn his head to look at her. He merely tightened his hold around Lyra's waist, letting out a soft, contented sigh as she continued to smooth down his hair. The dynamic had changed forever. The Empire had finally learned its lesson. Lyra was not a parasite holding back a hero. She was the absolute monarch of his soul. She was the only god Callan answered to. And the world now knew that to offend her was not a social misstep, it was an invitation to total annihilation. That's it for today's story. The Immoral Affairs Bureau formally reprimands Lady Lyra for weaponizing malicious compliance and turning a standard redemption arc into a national hostage situation. Emotionally destabilizing a tyrant until an entire kingdom kneels is not an approved diplomatic strategy, and the Bureau has completely run out of containment paperwork. Until further notice, please remain indoors, avoid anyone carrying knitting needles, and click like and subscribe as required by emergency compliance regulations.